Quite an introduction. Thank you very much, Mom. I had the opportunity yesterday to see some of the amazing work that Houston A+ Challenge is doing here in your city, and so I am in awe. I was very impressed, and it was very exciting and really inspiring. I'm really delighted to be in Houston. I'm a big fan of your city. I spent a lot of time here when I was younger, and so I kind of have Houston has a special place in my heart, so I'm happy to be back. I talk about a lot of different topics. Recently, a lot of people want to talk about the homework and homework loads. They also want to hear about how to deal with student stress, to which I say, parents, stop stressing yourselves, and that's a good solution. But anyway, I'm just nerdy enough to like talking about school reform the most. It's a big, wonky topic that encompasses just about everything we've done to our schools in the last 35 years. As you probably know, because I write for the New York Times and write often about New York City schools, although I do not do that exclusively, I also write about schools around the country. But because of that, I am a New Yorker. I talk fast, I'm loud. If you haven't figured that out yet, just give me a little time. And I have to confess that I'm not so crazy about my timing. I had nothing to do with this. So, yes, it is true. My mayor has stolen away your superintendent. Don't hold it against me. If anyone wants to know how things are going in New York with the two of them and the rest of the city, you can ask me later. I'll happy to give you information on what I know. When I first started writing about education, I thought I was getting into an easy beat. I had young kids. I had a daughter in preschool. I was in love with my daughter's preschool teacher. As far as I was concerned, there was John Dewey, who had invented progressive education, and then there was Miss Susan, who had a relationship to the American alphabet that was like unbelievable. So I soon figured out that I was not actually in such an easy beat. The first time I began to really notice and realize that when I began to hear about conversations around early literacy, which I learned were called the reading wars. I soon discovered that there were also the writing wars, the charter wars, the wars on teachers. It turned out this was actually quite a pugnacious beat. And then I began to go around the country to attend 6-hour-plus school board meetings in which really nice parents said really mean things to each other and to their school board members and to principals and superintendents. And I began to realize again that I was in for more than I had thought. Today, though, I'd like to rise above all those raucous education-related quarrels. And I'm sure you have none of those here in Houston, right? There's none of those. No long board meetings where people get really heated up. I do read. I have read the Houston Chronicle recently, so I know that I know where I am. So I'd like to sort of move beyond what we can agree on and talk about what I think's going on with school reform now, right? What's going on with it now. So it is an odd term, school reform, right? As far as I'm concerned at this point, it sort of means like anything that happens inside a school, you can call it school reform, right? Like you change the school lunch, you're like, that's a great reform. But it does mean something different to everybody, right? It means something different to everybody. But ultimately, school reform really means and stems from an authentic desire to make American schools work for all of our kids. Every single one of our children. And as you guys know here in this room, this is not an easy job. It's not an easy job. And it's really a job for optimistic dreamers, right? You have to be optimistic to do this work, and you have to be able to dream. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because one thing we have in this country, right? We have a lot of problems in this country. But one thing we have in spades is optimistic dreamers. So that's where we launch from here when we think about improving our schools. I do think we're at an interesting inflection point. 2018 arrives. We still have all of this controversy in Washington. Controversies over vouchers, Title IX, on college campuses. What do we do with for-profit colleges to regulate them? And we have all those little battles that I see all the time on school boards and inside school districts. But I've noticed when I talk to the folks in the big DC think tanks and the national nonprofits, that a lot of them are taking a kind of pause. They're doing a lot of soul searching. And I actually was talking this morning with a superintendent of one of your school districts here, and she told me the same thing. We're rethinking. What are we doing? Are we doing it right? So I know that for those of you who are in the weeds, teachers, principals, the idea that someone, group of thinkers stop to think, it can be kind of almost annoying, right? Because you all are in the weeds. You gotta make sure people are reading a grade level. You don't have time to take a few years off to think about it. But the folks that are doing the thinking are folks that have had an enormous effect, an enormous impact, have pumped billions of dollars into our school system. So we actually do want them to take a pause and think. And the questions that they're asking, the soul searching they're doing, relates to, have we made the enormous differences, the enormous improvements that we thought we would, and that we told you, parents and teachers, that we would make? Have we done that? And the answer is pretty sobering, right? It's pretty sobering. Because we have had about 35 years of school reform in this most recent iteration. Of course, school reform has been going on since the beginning of the American public school system started. But this most recent iteration really began with this, right? This report. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. This came out in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan commissioned it. It horrified us. It horrified so many of us. The writers of this report discovered that our education system was so mediocre that it threatened our very future as a nation. And another point in the report, which I still find incredible, is that the lead writers thought that if another country decided that we were going to be educated in the way we were educating our kids, if they sort of imposed that on us, we would consider it an act of war. That's pretty intense, and that was in the report. So what happened, as all of you know, is a lot of action. And what's important to note, though, is that the action did not come from the left. It didn't come from the right. It wasn't a blue state, red state issue. It wasn't a rich-poor issue. It wasn't a teacher-principal issue. It was a national, universal concern. And what did we get? We got a lot of new ideas pumped into the system, right? We got charters, we got voucher schools, we got closing of big public high schools, the opening of small schools. You know all of this. Testing, more testing, lots of technology. And then, of course, most recently, we got the Common Core. It was as if we didn't have all these other things that we were arguing about. But despite that, right, despite all of that, despite the billions of dollars, despite the fact that some of the greatest minds in the world, some of the greatest entrepreneurs in the world were on this, were working on this, our numbers weren't budging much. They haven't budged much. So in 1994, 36% of 12th graders were reading at grade level, and that's according to something called the Nation's Report Card, which is considered like the gold standard in terms of assessments. And in 2015, the last time 12th graders were recorded or tested, 37% are reading at grade level. I mean, that means in America, when you go through 13 years, you get the whole shebang of the American public school system, the chances are really, really grim that you're going to be able to read. That is scary. And that I know is not the way we all want it to be. And there lies a lot of frustration, right? A lot of frustration. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking now, or I don't know, maybe you're not, but I'm assuming at least some of you are thinking, this lady's really depressing. She's come here, I want to hear something inspiring, and she's just spewing these really depressing numbers, and I'm depressing. Journalists, as a rule, are depressing. we call ourselves skeptics because we think that sounds better. But my husband relates and sympathizes with you because he's always asking me, like, why is your glass always half empty? To which I tell him, you married a journalist, and you knew that was going to be the case. But I know that in addition to that, a lot of you probably think of journalists as being just a little bit biased. I don't know, a little bit. The journalists like to see what they want to see. They like to play the gotcha. They like to go into your schools and tell you all the things you're doing wrong. And we're guilty as charged. But many of us, although cautious and skeptic, right, about the work that's been done over the last 20 plus years, although we were cautious, many of us have been very optimistic. And we have wanted the work to be done to work for everybody. And we have been inspired and awed by the efforts, right? So that's a true thing. But at the same time, we've wanted to hold you all accountable. We've wanted to hold these folks who have been so big on accountability. We wanted to hold them accountable. To tell parents, to tell Americans what the numbers are really saying, just as I shared with you a little while ago, the numbers. But here's where things get kind of interesting and maybe not so depressing. Because if we have wanted to hold these folks accountable, it turns out, with all this soul searching that's happening, they too, reformers, big deal donors, they want to be held accountable as well. So they're saying to us, I know journalists, you're watching the numbers, but guess what? We're watching the numbers too, right? I hear this all the time now. In fact, I go into schools sometimes and I hear these folks who are doing everything they can to improve the schools. They're doing unbelievable work and they're just beating themselves up. They sit down and they say, oh, I thought that was very interesting. And they say, oh, it's not working. It's not working. I'm like, well, I thought it was really, no. I mean, really, did you see that? No, actually I didn't. I was looking at this other wonderful stuff with how, so it gets like, sometimes I just go, you got to give yourself a break. But I am, and many of us are enlightened and encouraged by the self-criticism, because like who gets better when they just say it's all fine? But as I said before, I'm hearing this from lots of corners, but perhaps the most interesting place I heard this from was recently the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who sends out an annual letter like, how are we doing? And last year, Sue Desmond-Hellman, who runs the foundation, had this to say: this has been a challenging lesson to absorb, but we take it to heart. The mission of improving American education is both vast and complicated, and we don't have all the answers. That is pretty humbling. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has spent billions of dollars on improving American schools, and they just said they don't have all the answers. It's like, if they don't have the answers, who's got the answers? So for many of us, for many journalists, the gotcha types, that was kind of like welcoming words. They're like, we told you so. But I'm not a daily journalist. Like, I don't go into schools and just write quick pieces. I spend weeks, sometimes months inside schools, right? And I heard this, these, and I've seen and heard these teachers and principals telling me that it's not working and on and on. And I know that because I see the numbers, but I also see things that I think are really amazing. I think all this failure talk might be too negative. And this is from a jaded journalist. So this is Mike Gallen. Mike Gallen is a math teacher at Kappa International High School in the Bronx. I love this guy. I just got to tell you, I love this guy. I watched him one morning give an engaging math lesson on functions while keeping a kid in the front row awake by tapping on his desk. And he was like snapping his fingers at this other kid who was talking too much to his partner. And watching him is a little bit like watching an orchestrated ballet. It's just like, you can't believe how gifted this guy is doing so much multitasking in a classroom. And if there are any classroom teachers in here or principals who see great classroom teachers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But anyway, Mike's students, though, are failures. And I mean that literally. They are failures. They failed the math algebra regents 4, 5, 6 times. And the algebra regents is what New York State students have to take in order to graduate. It's one of the math exams they have to take. And Mike began to wonder what was going on and why, despite the fact that he was a gifted teacher, that he wasn't able to move the dial here. And he began to think a lot about what it meant to be a failure and what it meant to have failed something multiple times and what that did to your spirit and what that did to your desire to try. And he began to realize something really interesting about the tests and the quizzes and the homework assignments that he was giving students like this one. They weren't finishing them, and many of the problems, the hard problems, they weren't even starting them. They wouldn't touch them, right? They wouldn't touch the hard problems. It wasn't like they'd kind of do some chicken scratch on it or like make a few efforts and then stop. They wouldn't even touch them. And Mike began to think that the reason they weren't doing this was because they were so demoralized that the idea of getting a problem wrong was just like too much for them to take emotionally. And so he decided to change the way he taught. And he did continue his very rigorous and engaging curriculum, but he began to infuse the curriculum with lots of conversations about fear, right? About fear and about what it felt like to tackle a hard problem. And he began to celebrate mistakes. So kids, the day I was in his classroom, would go up to the board and they would start and they'd make a mistake. And I saw one girl and she kind of started to cower and she wanted to sit down and she was feeling ashamed. And Mike started clapping. He started saying, a mistake, I see a mistake, what'd she do? And everyone started to look at the problem to sort of see it. And the idea that Mike was trying to convey, and I think fairly successfully, was that mistakes are how you get to success. And he used to say to the kids when I was there, and before I got there, he told me this is what he generally often said to them, was get it wrong now so you can get it right on the Regents. And the day that I was there, he also did something that I thought was really interesting, is when he got to the end of the day and he was doing a really hard problem, he said, I know this is the really scary one. I know you don't want to do this one, but you can do it. We can do this together. So when I see that, and I see that what happened after Mike instituted this new curriculum change, when he infused this kind of emotional discussion into the work, Mike's scores skyrocketed, right, of kids passing the algebra exam. And I guess I should kind of be a little bit careful here. I mean, it wasn't like 100% of the kids passed, right? But he was doing a lot better than he'd done before. So I don't think of that as failure. I don't think of it as failure at all. David Yeager's at the University of Texas, and he does a lot of work on belonging. I don't know if are people familiar with his work here? But he does unbelievable work, and it's so exciting because the work he's doing in his research lab is being used at high schools around the country and also at colleges. And the work is trying to figure out if belonging, if kids feeling like they belong, will allow them to persevere enough not to drop out of high school or college. What do we do to make them feel like they belong? And he discovered that there are these very minor tweaks, and they sound, honestly, they sound unbelievable. You're like, nah, that doesn't work. But apparently, if you let kids, when they first arrive, watch videos of other kids who talk about how they didn't feel like they belonged, but then began to feel like they were actually in a learning community that wanted them and accepted them, that the kids who just arrived took it to heart, and those had actually very long-lasting effects on them, those like 15-minute videos. And then after they watched the videos, what would sort of increase their odds that this would take for them was they would write a letter to future ninth graders or future college freshmen saying, I too felt like I didn't belong, but then, these are the things that I did to help me feel like I belonged. And so when I see that, and I see teachers all over the country at meetings and network events talking about using Yeager's work inside their schools and how it's actually having a great impact, I have a hard time thinking that what we're doing here is failing. Finally, Broome Street Academy in Lower Manhattan. Hundreds of homeless students shuffle through the doors of this teen crisis center to go to school. And Principal Barbara McEwen has created something really, really amazing, a mentoring program, high touch, exhausting for the teachers, but very effective.
I'm going to put the mission in sort of lay terms. It's to have a typical high school for non-typical learners.
Broome Street Academy is a campus, a high school campus, where students can come from disadvantaged backgrounds and high vulnerability situations to come to a school where they're known, they're cared for, and they're guided through rigorous academic programs.
We set aside 50% of our seats for students who are homeless, transitionally housed, or have been involved in the child welfare system.
How do we help teenagers regardless of their skin color, their socioeconomic backgrounds? Like, how do we figure out to help our students? And I think that's what makes our school really unique.
You're an individual, and here you become an individual that will not get lost or fall through the cracks.
We think first about relationships. With our champion model, we think a lot about what the impact of having a primary adult in a teenager's life means to success.
So that's Barbara McEwen. I got to sit in with Barbara talking to one of the children that she mentored, and I just could not hold back the tears. I mean, I just couldn't. It was so unbelievably inspiring. And Barbara's got kids who are really, really struggling, and she just wants to get them their high school diplomas, and she does everything she can to make sure they pass those exams and get through. Exhausting work. I know those of you who do mentoring know it's exhausting work. But when I look at that, again, am I looking at failure? Barbara came to the school and 30-something% of the kids were graduating on time, and now at least 75% graduate on time, which is above the New York City average. So that's pretty impressive. So again, I didn't think that when I was looking at that, I was looking at failure. So my job, right, my job is to analyze, is to connect dots, right, to see commonalities when I visit schools. But I have to say that I have become puzzled, or I had become puzzled, when I would see these numbers that didn't seem very inspiring, and then I would go on the ground and I'd see these schools that were inspiring, and I saw people that had these unbelievable visions and were living them out. And so I began to ask myself what it was that I was seeing. Right? What was I seeing? And I started to think, I think I'm seeing the impact of the school reform movement, right? The evil school reform movement. I think I'm seeing the positives of what that movement has done for folks inside schools, for educators. And so I came to this sort of like theory. I came up with this theory that there's a school reform toolbox that over the last 25 years has been developed. And it's a toolbox that Barbara and Mike and David Yeager are all drawing from. And it's a toolbox of values, and they're not values that are American. I mean, they're not values that are liberal, again. They're not values that are conservative. They're American values. And the first one of those values is urgency, right? We now have a sense of urgency. Everybody in this room feels urgently about helping kids and getting them better educated, improving our school system. Nobody anymore is kind of saying, oh, that's too bad that this school isn't a good school for that kid. Oh, well. So we have this unbelievable sense of urgency. Right? And then we have accountability. We all want accountability. I know in this room, there are probably 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different thoughts about what accountability should look like. Should we test? Shouldn't we test? When should the test happen? How should the test be? But I think we can all agree that we want to know how kids are doing. Can Johnny read? Can Johnny's classmates read? Can the kids in Johnny's school read? What about the district? What about the neighboring district? What about the city? How are these kids doing? Nobody wants to live in the dark anymore about this, right? We don't want to live in the dark about it. So we all value accountability, even though we're still fighting about what that should look like. And we should consider that a great victory, because it wasn't always like that. Remember, it wasn't always like that. It's very easy to have a school that wasn't performing and nobody knew about it, right? So we have accountability. And then we have expectations, right? Education, it's a luxury, it's a mortgage, it's a business. No, it's a right. So I think there was a time when we were all sort of complacent about the idea that if you didn't live in a good school district, that it was just unfortunate for you and your kid didn't get to go to a good school. I don't think we live in that time anymore. I think that if you are a parent in America and you have the choice, and many of us use those choices, right? We have a child who has ADHD and we have to rethink what school they go to. We have a gifted child, we have to rethink it. We have a child who's struggling with dyslexia. How many of us have exercised our choice aggressively and been so grateful to have it? And now, instead of looking and saying, oh, well, unfortunately, those people don't get choices, we don't do that anymore. We get enraged. I think it's hard to find a parent that wouldn't get enraged by the idea that a mom and a dad would feel stuck. And that rage is a good thing. It's a very good thing. So we have expectations now. And I know we're arguing about what this choice means, right? Is it just a great community school? And that is a good choice. Or is it voucher schools? Is it charter schools? Is it magnet schools? Like, what does that look like? So let's argue about that. Let's talk about that, right? Let's have different views on that and come to some kind of consensus. But we now have high expectations. And we have the idea that it's not okay to just have a school, an education. You should get a good education in America. We should pat ourselves on the back for that. We should thank the last 25 years of school reformers and school reform for increasing our expectations. And finally, innovation, right? We now value innovation. If it's not working in your school, you got to figure out a way for it to work. You got to come up with new ideas. That's what Mike did. That's why Barbara created the Champion program. She didn't see mentoring programs that she thought worked, so she created her own. Now, the areas I think, as far as I can tell from my visits around schools, the areas that you're going to see lots and lots of interesting innovation and where you should expect innovation is in technology, smarter technology, better technology. You should expect that, you should look for it, and you're going to see it coming down the pike, and don't settle. Don't settle in your schools for technology that's not really working, and don't let people push technology on you that you're not sure works. You don't have to do that anymore, and you're going to get more and more and better choices as time goes on. Got one example of that, and this is Quill. And I know that Quill is being used in some Houston schools because I talked recently with Peter Galt, who is the founder of Quill. I don't want to get into all the details about Quill, but basically it's a way to teach grammar to kids. And instead of it just being a multiple choice situation, the kids actually get maybe, in this example, it's like 2 sentences and they have to combine them. And the technology knows what the 300 most common answers are, and they have very specific responses, immediate responses to each wrong, each wrong answer. And so you can have a first submission, a second submission, a fourth. This stuff is so, and I'm the jaded, cynical journalist. I see a lot of things. I hear people talk to me. I don't believe them. I don't believe anyone. People talk to me all the time. If I don't know it's a truth, I don't believe it. But I saw this and I was really impressed. So if you have the opportunity to go and online and research this and think about it, I would highly recommend you do that. I know I sound like I'm doing a public service announcement for this guy who did this technology, but I really am impressed with it. The other place where you're going to see a lot of innovation, and you should start thinking about innovation, is grading. How we look at grading. Are we thinking of grading as punitive? Do we just think a couple of kids in the class should get an A? Or are we thinking that grading should incentivize students? Should we really see that everybody at the end of a unit got an A eventually in some algebra unit, some history unit? So sometimes it's called competency-based grading, standards-based grading. It's got lots of different names, but ultimately as parents, it means that you get report cards home and you have no idea what they mean, right? Because they're like all these different items of what your kid needs to know or does know. But the thing that's really exciting about it is the people that do understand these report cards, in many cases, in the best cases, are the kids. This kid, he's such a sweetheart at MS 442 in Brooklyn. He's showing me essentially a kind of ongoing report card, a live report card for his math class, his 7th grade math class. And I think there's 20 standards, or 15 standards, things like I can do division with multiple digits. And every time he learns a new unit in this math class, he gets to mark it with a green. And if he's almost there, he gets to mark it with a yellow. And if he's not there at all, it's a red. And he was showing me his improvements he was making. He was showing me what he learned, and he's showing me where he was close to getting into the green. So speaking about innovation, that is called the Hive. And that software, this is so cool, that software was developed by a math teacher at MS 442 who just decided, I like this accountability issue, we're going in this direction, I'm going to create the software for my school. So we have these kinds of innovations and in grading. Now, finally, we have collaboration. And I think that's ultimately the most important thing that we want to see in schools, people collaborating. And we also now understand that's a huge value. It doesn't mean that everybody is collaborating, but we know that everybody every educator knows that in an ideal world, we are all working together. So there are two places where I see collaboration that I think is really interesting and that I would encourage everybody to be thinking about. You're going to see more of it, and one of them is public-private partnerships, and otherwise I called social impact bonds. I don't know if anybody has seen those. But they are essentially when investment banks decide to invest in social welfare programs, and sometimes it's helping homeless people or helping folks who have just come out of prison not to recommit crimes. But more and more, you're seeing it for pre-K, for universal pre-K. And in the instance that I saw it, it was in the Granite School District in Salt Lake City, and the collaboration I saw was between an absolutely brilliant preschool director and a former investment banker who had started a nonprofit that was developing social impact bond projects, and Goldman Sachs and another nonprofit in the community all got together, and Goldman Sachs lent the school district $7 million, and they added thousands and thousands of preschool seats in what is a very high quality preschool program. And this is not even doing justice to it, but this is a teacher teaching the kids T's. What happened here, I think, is unbelievable and amazing, because Utah residents don't like spending money. They didn't want to spend money on preschool. They weren't convinced that it actually worked, and they didn't want to do it. And so the nonprofits and Goldman got together and they decided to do it. And because accountability was such a big part of the program, of course, because we all value accountability, it turned out that the program was working really well. And the following year, the state legislature said, we don't need you anymore, Goldman. We want to pay for this ourselves for this school district, and we want to expand it around the state. That's kind of a wonderful success story where you see businesses and community leaders coming together to affect change. So that's one. And the final area recently that I saw collaboration that really inspired me was in the Uva Motivate Lab, which is run by a guy named Chris Hallman. And Chris Hallman has got these long locks of blonde hair, and he just looks like a surfer dude. And then it turns out that Chris is actually one of the most respected researchers on motivation in the country. And I was hearing about Chris from New York City teachers who were using some of the stuff that he had researched inside their classrooms. And so, of course, as a journalist, I thought, well, I got to talk to Chris. And so I Skyped him one day, and he started telling me about the different stuff he was researching and what he was discovering. And so I said to him, well, what have you fixed in a school? Tell me. And he said, I don't work like that. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I ask practitioners what they need fixed. And I said, what's a practitioner? Right? He said, that's a teacher, Kyle. He doesn't call teachers teachers. He calls them practitioners. And he's pretty convinced they know a lot more about most things than he does. So he told me a story. He wanted to give me an example of how this worked. So he told me about his contact with a teacher in Northern Virginia, Thomas Harrison Middle School, Brendan Dernstein. And he and Brendan got together, and he said to Brendan, Brendan is a civics teacher, middle school civics teacher, and he said, Brendan, what do you need fixed? Not, let me fix a problem you don't have, but what do you need fixed? And Brendan and Holman suddenly got really, really granular. And it turned out that Brendan was having a really hard time getting his students to pass the unit on the judicial system, right? I mean, I still have problems figuring out how the American judicial system works, but it's a hard unit, and you understand why, right? So he said, I can't they're failing the test, and I can't get them to learn the material, to apply themselves to make sure they get it, because at the end of the year they have to take an exam, and the judicial system unit is going to be on it. So they started scheming, what Chris knew about motivation, what Brendan knew about his classes and his students. And so they said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to tell everybody they can take a retest, and we'll scrap the old test, and we'll just count the new retest. And it didn't work. It didn't motivate kids. So then they said, okay, let's try something new. And this is, by the way, this is how Chris works. This idea of quick, fast, try it doesn't work, try something else, then it works, you do it, right? Not let's do this for a year. Oh, let's do this for 2 years. Oh, God, we did it for 5 years. I don't think this is working. No. Chris is of this new philosophy of quick, fast. Works, do it. Doesn't work, scrap it, try something new. So the next thing they tried was to say to the kids, we'll give you time in class to study and then you can take a retest. It didn't motivate them. It was not motivating the kids. So then they said to the kids, we're going to tell each one of you how far away you are from passing this unit test. Some kids were 1 problem away, some were 2, some were 3. Guess what? They saw the light at the end of the tunnel. They saw a goal. They didn't just see failure when they got their bad test score. They saw exactly where they needed to go. And more specifically, the kids were told what areas they had not done well in, so they had an idea of exactly what they needed to study. The majority of the kids who failed the quiz took it again. His passing score, his average score before was 45%. And then it was 70%, which ended up being it was passing. Now, I know for a lot of us, it's like, that's not, incredible score, but remember, 45 was the original average score. So when I see that kind of stuff, I see that kind of collaboration, I'm really heartened. I'm really, really heartened because I see that Chris and Brendan are thinking a lot about collaborating. They're thinking about urgency. They're thinking about what can we do now? How can we work together? How can we innovate? And, the thing is that when I look at this toolbox, right, this toolbox that I've talked to you about, and I just actually, let me just give you this quote from the Motivate Lab before I end here. So, we start small, fail fast, and learn from our mistakes as we move forward. We are blurring the lines between researchers and practitioners as we move to improve the world. I love that. I love that. And go online and learn about the Motivate Lab. Chris loves collaborating with practitioners. So this idea that we are going to feel urgency, adhere to accountability, have high expectations, innovation, collaboration. These are not just school values. These are American values. This is how things get done in America. I think, I'm assuming someone here is wearing jeans. Whenever I think of jeans, I think of American sort of like innovation. I mean, don't you see that? Like every time every year your kids want a new kind of jean. That's American innovation, right? And nowadays they're the ripped ones, which I really don't like, but, right, so that's innovation, that's all these things. I look at my iPhone, I'm supposed to get an iPhone every couple of years because I feel this urgency, as all of us do, to get the new thing, because that's what we feel in America. That's what, companies make us feel because they're innovating all the time. So as we think about using these values to improve our schools, we must remember that these values are already used in our culture, in our businesses. And these values are used to create the American dream, right? To live up to the American dream. And that's not an insignificant thing. Because you know what? I know all of you hear all about Finland and how great Finland is. And wouldn't it be great if we just did what Finland did? But I never hear about the Finnish dream. Does anyone go, oh, I'm living the Finnish dream? They don't say that. No one says, oh, I'm living the Chinese dream, right? No one says, I'm living the Japanese dream. No, they live the American dream. We live the American dream because we value all of these things. We're going to use this to improve our schools. I, the jaded, cynical journalist who doesn't believe anybody, I have hope. I have a lot of hope. So I encourage you all to go out there and keep doing your amazing work. And I and all my journalist friends will keep watching you and telling you when we think you've made a mistake. But ultimately, we will be cheering you on. Thank you.